In this video, I'm going to get you ready for your pre-release and first few drafts of Outlaws of Thunder Junction, the newest expansion from Magic the Gathering. We're going to cover the mechanics, the top commons in each color, a quick guide for each of the 10 two-color archetypes, and finally the combat tricks to look out for when you're playing your matches. Let's start with the mechanics, and I'll start by covering the new keywords, outlaws, and crimes. Cards that refer to outlaws simply mean any creature with the type assassin, mercenary, pirate, rogue, or warlock. Easy enough. Next is a crime. You commit a crime whenever you target your opponent, anything they control, or anything in their graveyard. Some cards will reward you for committing crimes. And our first new mechanic is plot. Pay the card's plot cost and exile the card from your hand. You can then cast it from exile on a future turn without paying its mana cost. This may help you get a mana discount, use up extra mana you have laying around, or perhaps help you cast 2 spells in a turn, which is one of the limited archetypes of this set. The next new mechanic is Spree. For every additional ability you want to use on a card with Spree, increase the total mana cost by that amount. For example, with Jailbreak Scheme, you would need to pay 1 blue mana and 5 generic mana to use both of its abilities. Next, let's talk about mounts and saddles. Mounts are a new creature type. If these creatures attack while saddled, you'll get an extra bonus. To saddle these creatures, at sorcery speed, you can choose to tap any amount of other creatures with power greater than or equal to the saddle value. For example, with the Trained Erranks, it has a saddle value of 2, so if you tap a 2/2, your Erranks becomes saddled until end of turn. Whenever you attack with it saddled, it gains first strike and you scry 1. Meanwhile, the Drover Grizzly will give all your creatures trample if it attacks while saddled. Now that we know what's going on with the mechanics, let's get into my picks for the top commons in each color, starting with white. And in at number 3, Mystical Tether, a staple white removal spell. You'll be happy to have a copy or 2. Number 2, Sterling Keykeeper. This card is good early to attack with as just a 2-mana 2/2, but it's also good late to get blockers out of your way. Cards with flexibility like this tend to be quite powerful, especially in your aggressive decks where the 2/2 might not be useful later in the game. And number 1, Take Up the Shield. This is a reprint of the best white common from Dominaria United, and it will be good in this set too. This card has so much flexibility, it allows you to win combats, turn races in your favor thanks to lifelink, or just helps you dodge removal with the Indestructible. Let's move on to blue, and number 3, Stop Cold. Another staple removal spell that is solid pretty much every time we see an effect like this. Number 2 is Loan Shark, a solid body that replaces itself. It's also a rogue, which is relevant. This is a solid creature you'll be happy to play in any blue deck and almost always does what it's supposed to do. Although you lose a little bit of tempo doing it, the ability should be fairly easy to trigger. And number 1, Phantom Interference. This is a 2-mana counterspell some portion of the time, which you would play pretty often anyway, but for 5 mana you get to counter a spell and make a 2/2 flyer at instant speed, which seems crazy strong to me, and of course you could always just make a 2/2 if your opponent doesn't give you a target. Again, flexibility is super strong in a Magic card. Now let's move on to black, and number 3, Desert's Dew. Cheap removal wins games of limited and helps you gain a huge tempo advantage. Build around this a little bit and this card will be really strong. Number 2, Vault Plunderer. A 3-mana 3/1 isn't the best stat line, but it's pretty much a guaranteed 2-for-1, and 3/1s are actually really great blockers. And number 1, Consuming Ashes. Obvious choice for the best black common. Unconditional exile removal with possible upside. Take these highly. Now let's move on to red, and number 3, Prickly Pear. Besides the great name, cards that create multiple bodies tend to be quite strong, as there are lots of ways to use them, either by sacrificing them, chump blocking, going wide, or in this case the token even having its own ability. Number 2, Irascible Wolverine. As with the other example of a plot creature, you'll lose a bit of tempo if you do plot it, since you'll have to wait till the following turn to cast it, but you should have a very high chance at a solid 2-for-1 with this creature. And number 1, Explosive Derailment. Instant speed removal for most creatures at 3 mana is very good, but the possibility of a 2-for-1 makes this even better, even if you won't take advantage of it that often. And in at number 3, Patient Naturalist. Very likely a 2-for-1 that will help you hit land drops in green, and it even has the failsafe of netting you a treasure just in case. Very solid creature. Number 2, Spinewood's Paladin. Another variation of this type of creature we've seen over and over again. These have been consistently good for a long time, helping slower green decks stabilize against aggressive starts and serve as win conditions all in one package. The plot can even let you drop this earlier if you have nothing better to do with your mana. And finally, number 1, Throw from the Saddle, your go-to removal spell in green. It's cheap, deals damage rather than fights, and even buffs your creature, possibly permanently if you build around it. Besides being a sorcery, you can't ask for much more. Now let's do a quick overview of the 10 2-color draft archetypes. I'll share one of each archetype's signpost on commons. There are 2 in each color pair now actually, and give a brief overview of how the deck works, starting with blue-white Cast No Spells, and its signpost uncommon, Gem Lightfoot Sky Explorer. For 2 white-blue, we get a 3/3 legendary creature Human Scout. It has flying and vigilance. At the beginning of your end step, if you haven't cast a spell from your hand this turn, draw a card. Use plot cards to use your mana while not technically casting anything, which will trigger your other cards that care about you having not cast a spell this turn, like Wrangler of the Damned to make 2/2s, Canyon Crab to filter cards, and Prairie Dog that picks up counters. Next up is blue-black Crime Control and its signpost uncommon Intimidation Campaign. For 1 blue-black, we get an enchantment. When it enters the battlefield, each opponent loses 1 life, you gain 1 life, and you draw a card. Whenever you commit a crime, you may return Intimidation Campaign to its owner's hand. We want to draw out the game with good removal, which also happens to trigger our cards, generating long-term value, like with Lazav, the Forsaken Miner, and Slickshot Vaultbuster. Next is red-black Outlaws with At Knife Point as the signpost uncommon. For 1 black-red, we get an enchantment. As long as it's your turn, Outlaws you control have first strike. Whenever you commit a crime, create a 1/1 red mercenary creature token. This is an aggressive deck that makes use of the outlaw creature types: assassins, mercenaries, pirates, rogues, and warlocks. Don't worry if you forget what they are, it's right on the card in the reminder text. You'll get paid off for doing things you want to do anyway, like targeting your opponent's creatures with removal, aka committing crimes, or putting creatures with the outlaw types into play. The deck also generates lots of 1/1 mercenary tokens you can use as sacrifice fodder for cards like Corrupted Conviction and Unscrupulous Contractor. Next up is red-green Power 4 Matters and its signpost uncommon Cactus Folk Sureshot. For 2 red-green, we get a 4/4 Plant Mercenary with Reach and Ward 2. At the beginning of combat on your turn, other creatures you control with power 4 or greater gain Trample and Haste until end of turn. Another classic red-green beatdown deck, ramp with Hard Bristle Bandit and play threats with power 4 or greater to trigger your other stuff like Beast Bond Outcaster and Scalestorm Summoner. Next is green-white Mounts and Vehicles with Miriam Herd Whisperer as its signpost uncommon. For green-white, we get a 3/2 legendary creature Human Druid. As long as it's your turn, mounts and vehicles you control have hexproof. Whenever a mount or vehicle you control attacks, put a +1/+1 counter on it. This is another tribal deck, but for the mount creature type. If you can saddle these creatures and get extra value, great, but just try having them in your deck and building around their creature type with the 2 signposts, Miriam and Congregation Gryph, plus other cards like Frontier Seeker that help you find mounts in your deck, or Intrepid Stable Master that helps you ramp out mounts faster. Next is black-white Attrition and its signpost uncommon, Baron Bertram Greywater. For 2 white-black, we get a 3/4 legendary creature Vampire Noble. Whenever 1 or more tokens enter the battlefield under your control, create a 1/1 black Vampire Rogue creature token with lifelink. This ability triggers only once each turn. Play 1 in a black and sacrifice another creature or artifact to draw a card. Generate tokens and other sacrifice fodder with cards like Nezumi Linkbreaker and Mourner's Surprise, then use those cheap creatures and tokens for value, like with Baron's ability to draw cards, the Ruthless Lawbringer to blow stuff up, or Corrupted Conviction to draw more cards. Next up is blue-red 2 spells and its signpost uncommon, Crom Violent Cacophony. For 2 blue-red, we get a 2/3 legendary creature Zombie Horror. It has flying. Whenever you cast your second spell each turn, put a +1/+1 counter on Crom and draw a card. Use cheap spells like Harrier Strix and Reckless Lackey, plus plot cards like Lone Shark and Irascible Wolverine to make sure you can cast 2 spells in a turn, triggering your other cards. Next is black-green Recursion with its signpost uncommon, Honest Rutstein. For 1 black-green, we get a 3/2 legendary creature human warlock. When Honest Rutstein enters the battlefield, return target creature card from your graveyard to your hand. Creature spells you cast cost 1 less to cast. First, use cards like Restless Bloodseeker and Patient Naturalist to fill your graveyard with creatures, then recur them and win the late game with cards like Badlands Revival and Lively Dirge. Next is Red-White Mercenary Aggro, and its signpost uncommon, Form a Posse. For X Red-White, we get a sorcery, create X 1/1 Red Mercenary creature tokens. We have another deck that cares about types, this time for mercenaries. Create mercenary tokens with Prickly Pear and Wanted Griffin. The tokens help you punch your creatures through and deal more damage, and mercenaries also count as outlaws. So all those cards that care about that work here too, like Hellspur Brute and Mind Raider. Finally is blue-green big mana Plot, and its signpost uncommon, Doc Orlock Grizzled Genius. For green-blue, we get a 2/3 legendary creature Bear Druid. Spells you cast from your graveyard or from exile cost 2 less to cast. Plotting cards from your hand costs 2 less. Ramp with cards like Hard Bristle Bandit and Dance of the Tumbleweeds, then dump your mana into plot abilities like Lone Shark and Free Strider Commando, plus expensive card draw like Metamorphic Blast, and plan the heist to keep the threats flowing. And finally, let's go over the combat tricks you're going to see in your games. Knowing these spells can make or break games of Limited, so let's make sure you know what to look out for. I'm going to show you a mana cost, then you have to guess what card your opponent could be representing. Some of these you've seen already in the video, so feel free to pause it if you want to challenge yourself. Here we go. 1 and a white. Take Up the Shield. Put a +1/+1 counter on target creature. It gains lifelink and indestructible until end of turn. Blue. Take the Fall. Target creature gets -1/-0 until end of turn. It gets -4/-0 until end of turn instead if you control an outlaw. Draw a card. 1 and a black. Fake Your Own Death. Until end of turn, target creature gets +2/+0 and gains when this creature dies. Return to the battlefield tapped under its owner's control, and you create a treasure token. Red. Quick Draw. Target creature you control gets +1/+1 and gains first strike until end of turn. Creatures target opponent controls lose first strike and double strike until end of turn. Green. Snakeskin Veil. Put a +1/+1 counter on target creature you control. It gains hexproof until end of turn. For a full list of all of the instants in the set, I've provided a link to a Scryfall page down in the description, and if you found this video helpful, don't forget to drop a like and consider subscribing for future Magic videos just like this one. I'll see you next time.